Right, well, welcome everybody to this latest Zoom meeting of North London Friends of Israel. I'm Harry Goldstein on the committee of North London Friends of Israel. We intend the meeting to last about 1.5 hours maximum, I would say. Liz, I think, is going to speak for approximately 45 minutes, something along those lines, and we'll try to leave some time for questions. We did receive one question on email, and for other questions, please put them in the chat and we'll take them as they come. Well, those of you who are familiar with our work will know that our main focus in normal times is on local campaigning. We obviously couldn't do much of that during lockdown, so we started this practice of having meetings on Zoom to keep in touch with our supporters and to keep things going. We're delighted that we can now get back to local campaigning, and in fact we have done a number of street stalls since last summer. We've done them in Enfield, in Golders Green, in Hampstead, and in Barnet. And I'll say more about that later on. I don't want to take up more time on that because we're waiting to hear from our speaker. So I will say more about North London Friends of Israel at the end of the session. So to tonight's topic, we're delighted to host Elizabeth Arif-Fear. Liz is a British Muslim and award-winning activist, passionate about protecting human rights, promoting peace, and strengthening intercultural and interfaith cohesion. Her main interests include women's rights, refugee and migrant rights, and issues surrounding multiculturalism, anti-extremism, and community cohesion, in particular, Jewish-Muslim relations. Elizabeth is founder and director of Voice of Salam, trustee of Muslims Against Antisemitism, and a local co-chair for Nisa Nashim, the Jewish Muslim Women's Network. For those who aren't aware, Nisa and Nashim are the Arabic and Hebrew words for women, respectively. She's written for a range of organizations and publications, including Globe Post, Haaretz, and Jewish News, and is a published poet. Once strongly anti-Israel in her views, she's now a Zionist. She's a committee member of the UK Friends of the Bereaved Families Forum, and I'm very proud to say, a committee member of North London Friends of Israel. In 2019, Liz won the St. Ethelburger's Award for Sacred Activist of the Year, and in 2020 took part in the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations fellowship program focused on peace in the age of new media. She's delighted to now be a CAICID fellow. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah.
I have to explain. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's an intergovernmental organization working on interfaith and religious relations and cultural dialogue. So it's with great pleasure and interest that I hand over the floor to Liz.
Thanks, Harry.
And I'm now going to share screen as well because Liz has a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, while we wait for the slides, thanks everybody for coming this evening, and it's great to be able to be here and to share my story. As Harry said, if you've got any questions, we can cover that at the end. So yeah, we'll be interested to hear your views.
Oh, just a moment.
Just waiting for the slides. Yeah, so tonight is all about my personal story. I was once very anti-Israel and now identify as a Muslim Zionist. So I think it's an interesting story to share. I think we can learn a lot from it. So that's what we'll be going through this evening. Next slide, Harry. So I've broken the journey down into sort of the main stages of that relate to my life. So we're going to start looking at me as a young left-wing activist, so my view of Israel in terms of relating to my human rights campaigning, then my conversion to Islam, how that added to the cause. We'll then look at my interfaith journey and how that affected my views on the Jewish community and the relationship between the Jewish community and Israel. And then finish off with where I am today. I'm Zionist, what am I doing, what am I working on? And to finish, key takeaways moving forward. So what can we learn from this journey, from this experience, and where do we go from here? Next slide, Harry. Yeah, so a bit about me. I was born in the Midlands. I'm British Italian. Grew up as a vaguely practicing Christian with a Christian mom and atheist father. Did my studies in Birmingham and then spent some time living in Algeria and Spain. I've been in London now for about 6 years, and that's really been sort of the start of my interfaith journey and getting to know the Jewish community. I work in a human rights NGO and I do a lot of interfaith activism around that. Any questions, we can cover that at the end. Thanks. Next slide, Harry. Yeah, so left-wing activism. I got involved in sort of human rights campaigning from my late teens, something I'm still very passionate about. And that, along with sort of mainstream narratives, I obviously gained a particular view of Israel. I was very anti-Israeli, very anti-Israel. And if you want to just click on the slide, Harry, this is what I thought of when I thought of Israel. So as you can see here, I thought it was horrible. I thought it was an unjust country. I couldn't understand why it should exist. I thought, land had been stolen from Palestinians. I thought it was evil. BDS was a big part of my life. I'll talk more about that later. But I've strongly supported that, and I boycotted sort of drink shops, companies. Selfish, horrible. Thought that whatever I would buy would have an effect on Palestinian children and would cause their suffering. So you can see from this kind of word cloud, I had a very sort of one-sided view, I had a very strong view, despite a lack of knowledge of the region on Israel. So that kind of represented my main standpoint on Israel. I wasn't majorly involved in kind of anti-Israeli campaigning, but being in those sort of circles, I had my views and they were pretty strong. I was certain that I would never visit Israel, and that I wanted nothing to do with the place. Okay, next slide, Harry. So I'm sure we've all seen this map. I think my interest sort of, or my perceived knowledge kind of peaked when I was living in Italy and I started learning Arabic and my teacher was Palestinian. And it was interesting because we had another teacher in the university who, although I wasn't studying Arabic at the university, but obviously we were all linked. She was Israeli. So obviously I heard a particular narrative from my Palestinian teacher. And she talked about how the Israeli teacher was coming around to the suffering, etc. And the conversation I had with a British friend of mine who was also living in Italy just kind of highlights where I was at. So I heard her side of the story. I didn't know much about the background. And I remember my friend saying, well, there's got to be more to it than that, Liz. There must be two sides. There must be something else. And I shut him down. I said, no, this is it. The Palestinians are suffering. It's, this is it. I didn't see it as a conflict per se, but more that there's an unjust oppressor. And this map kind of highlights the things that I would encounter at university fairs, on social media, all in the media, the idea that there was this one Palestinian state, and then all you're seeing from the map is the shrinking land and the idea that their land's being taken away by Israelis. Next slide, Harry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Okay.
So I mentioned that I boycotted companies that invested in Israel. These were the sort of images that I would think of. Palestinian children suffering. We've got an IDF soldier here. We've got the wall, the idea of kind of control, oppression, suffering. I had good intentions. I honestly thought, it sounds a bit silly now, but that in, for example, buying Coca-Cola, I'd be kind of complacent and causing the suffering of Palestinian children, and I didn't want that. So I carried on boycotting goods, and my viewpoint was primarily in trying to help Palestinians against this oppressor. Next slide, Harry. So, as I said, I had good intentions. In my mind, I'd separated the Jewish community and Israel. So for me, the Jewish community was all about Judaism, a religion on the one hand, and on the other hand, we had Israel. It was a land and it was all about politics. I fervently believed in anti-Semitism as a wrong thing. Obviously, my knowledge of that was incredibly limited. I separated anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism completely. For me, Zionism, it was a dirty word. The name Israel, Israeli, Zionism, they all had that sort of horrible tinge. Didn't like hearing it. It was that horrible word that when you saw something on the package, for example, of dates or whatever it was, you'd think, oh gosh, I need to avoid that. Wasn't comfortable hearing it in conversations. It stood out. Obviously, I'd separated these two. I didn't really understand the connection. I was completely unaware, really, of the overall connection between the Jewish community and Israel. I obviously sort of, in my mind, thought some Jews are pro-Israel, some are not. I was completely unaware that the vast majority of the Jewish population globally are Zionist, whether they use that term or not. So I firmly believe that anti-Semitism is wrong, but I would say we can't be told that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That's a completely separate idea. So I was quite strong in that view. Next slide, Harry. So we look at the image here. So it's not a conflict when there is only one oppressor. That kind of pretty much sums up the idea of what I had of the conflict and of the Palestinian cause. The Palestinians were suffering and Israel was to blame. As I said, I had good intentions. I didn't want any harm. I didn't wish harm on people. But what I did do was I had a complete lack of knowledge. And these narratives and these beliefs can be harmful. They drive people apart and they perpetuate false narratives. Obviously, now I believe that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, unless you are one of the very few people in the world that doesn't believe in nation states. And I stand firm in that, and I do follow the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Looking back, I had a complete lack of knowledge. I didn't understand Judaism as an ethno-religious group, and I think to this day, that's something that is vastly misunderstood. And if we look at sort of hate comments on Twitter, people will often get confused by that term, and they'll say, well, you can't be an atheist and be Jewish, and they'll talk about religion not needing to stay, and they don't understand the Jewish people as a tribe. Again, I had a complete lack of understanding of the Jewish community's religious, social, and cultural connection to Israel. I think we also see a lack of diversity of the Jewish community in anti-Israeli narratives. So, for example, the idea that a lot of Israelis are just Polish people, that focus on Ashkenazi Jews who aren't Polish, they're obviously ethnically Jewish, but not understanding, again, that ethnic connection and not really knowing much about Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews and that specific MENA relationship, and obviously the wider overall connection to Israel of the whole Jewish community. Obviously, I believe the Holocaust is wrong. I even commemorated the Holocaust Remembrance Day, again, just showing that kind of mismatch between having one perception of the Jewish community, but then completely misunderstanding the wider kind of experience. Looking back, obviously, I did do quite a bit of study on anti-Semitism, actually. When I was at university doing my master's in translation studies, I translated part of a book in Italian that was looking at the word Jewish and all of the different kind of history behind that term and history of discrimination. Obviously, I was taught about the Holocaust in secondary school, but that was it was a private school, but obviously mainstream Holocaust education. It was, primarily factual. We weren't meeting any Jewish people. We weren't meeting survivors. So obviously, it was a very sort of limited education there. Obviously at the home, very sympathetic to that cause. My dad always said your brother being severely autistic would have been persecuted, and we're all very sensitive to that, but obviously I lacked that kind of knowledge of what it was like being a second, third generation survivor. I didn't know anybody that was directly affected from the Jewish community. And I obviously lacked knowledge of pre and post Holocaust persecution. So the Farhud, so the expulsions and killings in Iraq and other pogroms pre and post Holocaust, I didn't know about that either. Obviously, a bit of history of medieval persecution. I did study the Dreyfus Affair, got quite a good mark on it, actually. So I looked at the different strands in terms of anti-Semitism from Christian ideology, politics at the time, but it was limited. Another thing that was limited was my connections with the Jewish community. So as we said, the left-wing kind of human rights sphere is predominantly, I would say, anti-Israeli. And it's sort of, you'd sort of pick up that narrative from that kind of work. Also, the Jewish organizations and people that I were encountering had the same beliefs as me. With the name Jewish or ever proudly Jewish, it kind of fed that narrative that you can be Jewish and be completely anti-Israeli and the two are connected. It fed the misinformation. Now I recognize that these are fringe groups, but due to their popularity, they're outside of the Jewish community predominantly, their visible perception and the way they present sort of online, offline, they're quite popular in sort of Muslim and non-Muslim spaces. And we're going to look now, who are these people? Next slide, Harry. So the Neutro Carter, the funny thing is, I didn't even know their name, but as we can see, for somebody who doesn't know much about the diversity of the Jewish community, religiously, culturally, etc., you see the picture and you think they look pretty Jewish. It's a pretty ignorant standpoint, but they look pretty Jewish. They're dressed that way. They're proudly Jewish. They don't hide their Jewish identity. And if we look at the signs, we've got Free Palestine, End Israeli Occupation. And then this is the one that really kind of hits it on the head. Zionism and Judaism are extreme opposites. First of all, we can see that it's the focus on Judaism as a religion and not really explaining the kind of ethnic, ethno-religious history of the Jewish people. And secondly, obviously, it's dividing Judaism and Zionism again. So feeding the idea that, you know, a good Jew is this, you don't have to believe in Israel, good Jew, bad Jew, Zionist, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, etc. We see them a lot kind of on social media, out and about. They've got the Palestinian flag. They're very fervent in their beliefs. I think a lot of kind of anti-Zionist and anti-Israeli folk will know these. And the fact is, because they present as visibly Jewish and proudly Jewish, and not knowing about how they're perceived in the community and their beliefs in terms of Israel now and in the future, and their religious beliefs about the existence of Israel, they kind of back up your beliefs that, yeah, I'm anti-Israeli, but I'm not anti-Semitic, because look, here's somebody out proud and Jewish, and they believe what I believe. Obviously, I was unaware of their links to Iran, even the name Torah Jews, it just kind of tends to give that legitimacy to what you're doing. And as I said, that religious pride. So it kind of fed my, well, you know, I support the Jewish community, but I don't support Israel. And look, these people, they have the same beliefs as me. Next slide, Harry. Another one, Jewish Voice for Peace. I mean, it kind of says it all in the name. Peace comes across very, you know, loving, wanting peace, wanting things to progress positively. Jewish, again, you think, oh, great, here's a Jewish organization that has my beliefs, we're on the same page. So taken from their website, they say, Jewish Voice for Peace opposes anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, and anti-Arab bigotry and oppression. JVP seeks an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, security and self-determination for Israelis and Palestinians, a just solution for Palestinian refugees based on principles established in international law, an end to violence against civilians, and peace and justice for all peoples of the Middle East. Now, if you don't really know much about them, that seemed pretty fine. But if you actually look more closely at what they believe in and kind of their standpoints, they say, Jewish Voice for Peace is guided by a vision of justice, equality, and freedom for all people. We unequivocally oppose Zionism because it is counter to those ideals. Now, that in a nutshell pretty much sums up what I believed. I wanted what I believed was justice, equality, and freedom. I still want that now for both peoples. But at the time, obviously, I didn't believe in Zionism. I thought it was horrible. It was a horrible belief, and now I identify as Zionist. But it was this group, obviously there are non-Jewish groups as well, but groups like this really kind of, you see their materials you'd be sharing. I still see Muslims sharing this, or with, you know, good intentions, thinking, well, this is a Jewish group, they have the same beliefs as us. And it just kind of perpetuates this idea of the kind of good Jew, bad Jew, and really doesn't get to the crux of this anti-Zionist problem. Next slide, Harry. So that was my kind of like left-wing activism. And then I think the next kind of area of my life that was significant in this story is my conversion to Islam. So I converted to Islam about 10 years ago. So I was in my early 20s. And it didn't sort of change my beliefs as such, but what it did was it kind of sort of backed up those beliefs. So as a Muslim, we obviously all have different kind of cultural, ethnic origins. We're one religious community, and we have the concept of the Ummah, so the idea that we're one sort of global religious family. So even though I'm not Arab, the idea that because Palestinians, obviously there are Christian Palestinians and the people that may not be Muslim, but majority, let's imagine, or statistically would be Muslim or come from a Muslim background. The idea that their suffering is our suffering, we need to support them. And so I suppose it really kind of solidified that belief. And obviously I'm coming with one belief that checks out the same as a Muslim. Generally, I mean, it depends. People are a bit more diverse in their beliefs than we might think. People might also be scared to speak out. But I would say generally the Muslim community is very anti-Israeli, at least in this country and in the circles that I was in. I mean, for example, I work in certain spaces and people would say Israel, so Israel, hell. You know, you certainly wouldn't say you're a Zionist. I don't hide the fact that I'm a Zionist, but I wouldn't sort of shout it out loud in certain spaces. It would depend where I am. And again, the MENA connection. So I spent time in North Africa, and I would also witness things such as, oh yes, we like our Jewish brothers and sisters, but we don't like Zionists. Well, the thing there is that doesn't really make sense because most Jews are Zionists. So again, it's that sort of supposed good intentions. Obviously not everybody. We have people who are extremists and who are violent, but a complete kind of lack of information. Okay, next slide, Harry. So where did this lead me? Left-wing kind of historical activism, Muslim, firmly believing and supporting brothers and sisters. Yeah, I was fully anti-Israeli and I firmly believed in BDS, so boycotting Israeli goods. So, I mean, I'm not going to name lots of brands, but, you know, it was really easy you'd go online and there's websites, you'd find all about the different shops and companies. So high street shops, I stopped shopping at certain brands. Certain food and drink, I wouldn't eat. Certain companies, I would switch for a different one. If I saw that the label said made in Israel, I wouldn't have it. I certainly didn't want to visit Israel. I thought if I wanted to visit areas of Palestinian territories, that I would go through Jordan. That's quite an extreme view because, you know, you could just pass through Israel in terms of a sort of administrative trip, but that wasn't working for me. I didn't want to give them any of my money. And obviously I was completely cut off from Israelis and Jewish life. I did have a couple of colleagues who were Jewish at uni, but I wasn't engaged with the community. I didn't have any kind of close Jewish friends. So I had nobody to kind of learn from to counteract these views. Next slide, Harry. So where it also changed again is I lived in Spain for a while, and then I moved back to the UK. I got involved in planning an interfaith peace festival in my hometown of Stafford. When I was a Christian to when I was a Muslim, my identity was quite different, obviously. When I was a Christian, obviously that's my kind of cultural, religious background. I wasn't particularly practicing. As a Muslim, I'm not traditionally practicing now. I'm very progressive and sort of do my own thing. But obviously as a Muslim, kind of my identity was changing. I was working out who I am. I was identifying with this new religion. I was outwardly more religious. So I was sort of exploring who I am and how I relate to other faith communities. And when I moved down to London, that's when things really changed. So I'd already had this interest in interfaith work from this peace festival in Stafford, where I didn't know anybody who was Jewish. At the peace festival, we were predominantly a team of, say, Hindu, spiritualist, Christian, Muslim. I know there's a Jewish population in Birmingham, but I don't think there's anyone really in Stafford. London, obviously being the largest Jewish population, things changed. I'm obviously very glad they did. I would see more Orthodox men out and about. And one day I was sat at Euston train station and I saw an Orthodox man with the pale, the curls, and I didn't know what they were. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I'll Google that and see what it means. So I Googled it, looked it up and thought, well, you know what? I don't know much about this community. Well, that's a bit sad, really. A couple of reasons why I thought this is something I need to change. Firstly, I believed I have Jewish heritage, which I'm still trying to look into. Secondly, Islamically, we do believe that Jews, Christians and Muslims are all part of the Abrahamic family, not in sort of coincidental terms, but in the fact that we believe that the Torah did come from God, who we believe is the same God. So there's a connection there, and I think it's important to understand one another as a Muslim, but also just kind of socially and culturally. It's important to know our neighbours, to get to know one another. I thought it was quite sad. I don't really know much about this community, so I'd like to get involved. And this was really like the big moment. I Googled and found a Jewish Muslim women's group at West London Synagogue. So I emailed them and agreed that I would come to one of their sessions. I think it was on a Tuesday. And at the same time, a friend of mine from back in Stafford, who's chair of Misnashim now, she bought me a ticket to one of their conferences. So I had these sort of two elements coming together. I had actually visited synagogues abroad. As I said, even though I was very anti-Israeli, I was very much interested in Jewish culture. The first synagogue I visited was in Morocco, actually. I visited quite a few since then in Morocco. I'd visited sort of Jewish history museums in Vienna, So the interest was there, but I hadn't actually been to a functioning synagogue in the UK. So I went to WLS, and that was a first, a bit nervous, and I really, really enjoyed the session. And on that day, they announced that they were joining the Nisa Nashim network. Now, Nisa Nashim stands for women in both Hebrew and Arabic. And it's a network of Jewish women. The headquarters is in London, and how it functions is we have lots of different groups of women all over the UK. The idea is to get women together, break down those barriers, break down those misconceptions, some engage in social action, raise their money for charity or working towards a cause. It's a really good thing for promoting women's leadership. It's really helped me. I've made some great friends. Promoting fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate. It's a great network. If you've got any questions on it, do let me know at the end. It's been a great part of my life. So I was getting more involved in this in Nashim, and the group at West London Synagogue, ran by Rabbi Helen, who's in the picture here, said, okay, we're joining this network, and their model is you have a Jewish co-chair and a Muslim co-chair. So obviously she was going to be the Jewish co-chair. She'd been running the group, which had been running for about, I think, 10 years. She said, we need a Muslim co-chair. And they asked me if I wanted to be the co-chair. I was quite shocked. And they knew I was going to the conference. I must have seen keen. So yeah, I got on board. And with Rabbi Helen and another colleague of mine, we ran that group for a couple of years. And West London Synagogue kind of became a second home for me. I got involved in other interfaith work there, an interfaith cooking program, helped at the night shelter, and I attended all kinds of different events, such as an interfaith Seder, lots of different events. The picture here is actually an iftar. We had one Ramadan. The gentleman on the left, I think, was a Christian visitor. Yeah, it was a really, really nice time being at West London Synagogue, learned a lot. And this was the start of the journey where I had the interest in Judaism, but eventually I found that I was going to have to face what was the elephant in the room, Israel. So, for example, at Interfaith Seder, I was sat down happily in the synagogue and noticed that the matzo on the box, it said made in Israel, obviously. But I was at the point at the very beginning where I still thought, made in Israel. But I just had to move past it. But eventually, having conversations is where I've led to now. Speaking to friends, learning more about the conflict, learning more about the Holocaust, learning more about their links to Israel, having family and friends there. I'm not Arab, I'm not Palestinian, I don't have any family over in the Middle East that I know of. So it really became the starting point, having not had those connections, to now talking and getting to know people's side of the story, so to speak. Next slide, Harry. So I think interfaith work, while it's given me great social connections and I've learned a lot about Judaism religiously, I think the biggest thing for me has been about understanding the Jewish community and their connection to Israel. So as I said, I learned more about the Holocaust. I don't just believe that Israel exists because of the Holocaust. That's not my belief. But I think understanding the role of the Holocaust, the need for a safe space, and also all of the persecution before the Holocaust, I think is really important. Again, the Farhud, I don't think that's something that a lot of Muslims or people outside the Jewish community know about. I learned a lot more about that, the presence in Iraq and also around the Middle East. Generally, understanding the historic connection, so the religious connection, the ethnic connection, so, the origins of the Jewish people, and the cultural connection. Mizrahi identity, I think, was another thing that really taught me a lot. And overall, this just kind of emphasized that who are the Jewish people, where are they from, what's their background, and the need for Israel as a safe space. And I totally believe in that now. Again, Zionism was a dirty word for me. It's something I didn't understand. I think a crux point for me was obviously identifying with anti-Zionists before in terms of, Jewish Voice of Peace, etc. But it came to a point where I was making all these friends and they were lovely people. And sometimes I'd hear somebody say, oh yes, but I'm a Zionist and I support the Palestinian cause. And I thought, but you're a really nice person. I don't really get what that means. And I spoke to a friend one day and I said, because I got really confused. I was making all these friends and, we shared a belief in, say, like two-state solution, peace and security for both peoples. And I said to her, are you a Zionist? And she goes, yes. And it was really at that point where it was about, actually, did I understand what the word Zionist is? Yes, most Jews are Zionist. It's not that I'm getting on with these nice people who aren't Zionists and then there's Zionists in the corner. Most Jews are Zionists. I mean, I found people who perhaps don't identify with the word, but do believe in Israel's existence. So I think it varies. But that was a bit of a turning point for me, realizing that these are nice people, of course. Most Jewish people don't want to cause harm. They're nice people. They believe in safety and security for both people. They want peace. So knowing that, I had to adjust my understanding of Zionism. And obviously I learned what that meant as a broad term, and that, you know, there's differences in terms of religious Zionism, political Zionism. You might be left-wing, you might be right-wing, and also just the numbers. Whether they identify with the term or not, most Jews are Zionists and do have a connection with Israel, which is why I firmly believe that in interfaith dialogue, for example, it can only get so far before we really address this elephant in the room. And I think it can be done, and it's really, really powerful, and it's definitely helped me. Next slide, Harry. So on the one hand, learning more about the Jewish community and the side that I'd never explored. The other hand, unpacking the bias. I'd obviously come from a very biased background in terms of the media, the NGOs I was following, etc. So something which I've really learned a lot more about is Hamas. I didn't really know anything about them. I didn't know their charter. I didn't know, I just didn't know anything, which sounds quite ridiculous, actually. And I found that Hamas is really sort of like the litmus test with people. When we've had peaks of conflict that have then kind of created tension here in the UK, people who are seemingly pro-peace, when I've mentioned that Hamas shouldn't be doing X, Y, Z, it just shuts the conversation down. They feel like I'm sort of trying to justify, I don't know, violence against Palestinians. I find that that's really a point of misinformation and where things really get tricky in conversation. Again, Arab rejectionism, I didn't know about, the failed peace deals and any of that. Inadequacy of the PA, again, now recognised as a conflict in which you've got obviously governments who need to work together. Now I, recognise the failings of the PA. And really, again, having not known Israelis or Jewish people in relation to Israel, now recognising the suffering of Israelis. When I was writing a blog or doing a piece on the conflict, I was looking for pictures. And it was very easy to find pictures of kind of destroyed buildings in Gaza, children looking upset, etc. But I was looking, to balance it, to find something in Israel. And the only pictures I could find were IDF pictures of children in a bomb shelter. Now, I don't have a problem using IDF images, but that's a very limited source. And it just goes to show the lack of nuance in the media and how we're not really hearing about Israelis and their suffering. Well, I was meeting people who have family and friends there who would talk about having to go to a bomb shelter, who'd be worried and directly affected. And obviously that made a big impact. Next slide. So I was getting to know people. I was getting to know about their relationship to Israel. And then I started exploring this further. I found some great organizations who work on reconciliation in the region. So a way of getting involved, but in a positive way, free from anti-Semitism and hate. At one of the Nissan Hashim conferences, we had the Bereaved Families Forum. Don't know if any of you know them. People who've lost family in the conflict. So their motto is, with the organisation where we don't want new members. Robbie, who was Israeli, came to the conference and gave us a talk. Her Palestinian counterpart couldn't come because of visa issues. And she talked about how she'd lost her son, how he was murdered. And I've seen her speak again with Bassam, whose daughter was also murdered, was also killed. I interviewed them for the blog. I now work with the UK group on the steering committee to supporting advocacy with their work overseas. Solutions Not Side, seeing a young Israeli and Palestinian talk together, come together, talking about the issues, and just seeing the range of great organisations doing work out there that are obviously more balanced, more nuanced, and away from this fervent anti-Zionist left-wing kind of campaigning. So Roots, I interviewed a great guy for my blog on Voices Salam. He grew up in the West Bank, and then the blog talks about him going to Israel, visiting Yad Vashem, just kind of really learning more, similar to mine, obviously, but a lot more locally centralised. His story, Children of Peace, Women Wage War, again, like Mr. Sheen, The Power of Women, just some great work going on there. And that kind of gave me the space to look at the conflict, but in a more helpful way. So helping Israelis and Palestinians who are doing work. And that is something that I found as another litmus test because, for example, there's this one woman who liked to troll me online. When I shared an article about Robbie and Bassam and their grief and how they work together for reconciliation, she said, oh, that's Stockholm Syndrome. And I think that's the real difference. To shut down Israelis and Palestinians who are actually doing productive work, I think you can see the difference between somebody who genuinely cares about Israelis and Palestinians and somebody that's just on a hate wagon, basically, on like a hateful narrative. Also learning more about Israeli culture, Israel as a country. a diverse country, and with that, Arab Israelis who love being Israelis. So seeing Yosef Haddad, for example, campaigning out about in the UK and Ireland, and Israeli and Palestinian activists such as himself, who are nuanced, who stand up against hate and are doing, productive work. Next slide, Harry. So where's all this led? Well, today I identify as a Zionist, and honestly, if you'd said this to me in my early 20s, I would have never believed you. It seemed like the most far out idea possible. So I've gone from those experiences to now using my experience and getting involved with organizations which are making a difference. So now I spend my time fighting anti-Semitism, helping organizations focusing on Israel-Palestine reconciliation, strengthening Jewish-Muslim relations, and on pro-Israel advocacy. So a couple of organizations that I work with, as Harry said, I'm on the steering committee of North London Friends of Israel and the UK Friends of the Pre-Families Forum. I also work with Holocaust and World Aid Trust, heavily involved in Isn't Assumed, to which I owe a lot. I'm a trustee of Muslims Against Antisemitism, and my own organisation, Voices Islam, has become a lot more involved in Jewish-Muslim relations. For example, running social media campaigns on anti-Semitism according to the IHRA definition, publishing those blogs and stories, and just getting more nuanced views out there. Next slide, Harry. So what next? Well, it's time that I visited Israel. The pandemic sort of shut that down. Busy woman, but I'm hoping to go next year and do an interfaith trip. So, see the region and all the context. But I'd also like to visit Israel just for the country that it is, spend some time in Tel Aviv, explore Israeli culture. Hopefully I can tag on some days on that trip. So yeah, getting to know Israel. I've got obviously a lot of interest in Israel, but need to go. Some great things that I want to see. So traveling to the region, further advocacy and more dialogue. And really, I think we need to be debunking the Z word. Don't be scared to use it. I think had I understood the term Zionist better earlier, it would have helped me a lot in my journey. Okay, next slide, Harry. So, sorry, excuse me. Key takeaways. What can we learn from this? Where do I think we can go with this? As I said, don't be scared of the word Zionist. We need to debunk this idea of sort of good Jew, bad Jew, Zionist, anti-Zionist. I think people outside the community really, really don't understand the term. And I think it's important to kind of break that down. So yeah, further education on Zionism, definitely education on Hamas and the PA. I think we need to be raising further the voices of Palestinian, Israeli and Arab Israeli peace activists that, doing positive work, showing that Israelis suffered too. Sounds ridiculous, but for example, a couple of years ago, I was on a train and saw an Israeli couple. I think they told us they were from Israel. Obviously, wish them no harm. They seemed really nice. And it was a bit of an odd moment for me because here was a lovely couple on holiday in London and they seemed really nice. And I'd never been similarly face to face with Israelis before. And they were just perfectly normal, nice people. But before, I thought Israelis were selfish. Why would you want to live there? You don't deserve it. Why would you do that? And again, what we see in the media, Israelis are suffering too. And with that, also just celebrating Israeli life and culture. We hear a lot of things about, oh, they stole hummus and falafel, or they don't have their own culture. Well, actually, it just shows a lack of understanding about the Jewish communities overseas over time. And I think Israeli culture looks great. I think it's somewhere that I would really, really love to explore. And I think we need to celebrate that. And definitely wider education on the Jewish community. Religiously, how you could be a secular Jew, an atheist Jew, that confuses a lot of people. That was one of the first things I learned, actually. The Jewish people as a tribe, an ethno-religious group, and definitely more education on anti-Semitism. Promoting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and particular things such as, yes, if you compare the conflict to the Holocaust, that is anti-Semitism. If you have a disproportionate focus on Israel, that is anti-Semitism. So, for example, I would campaign about China and other countries, but obviously I think China was possibly because it's very difficult to boycott everything from China. But I do remember my dad saying, well, so you're going to boycott this place and that place? And I said, no, but I was boycotting Israel. So again, this disproportionate focus. And, fighting ideas about this sort of greater loyalty to Israel and, all clauses of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Next slide. So that's me. If you've got any questions, we've got time after to answer those or to discuss anything or for feedback. If you're on social media, here's my Twitter and Instagram. Still a bit new on Instagram. I'm on there. And if you've got any questions or just like to get in touch, that's my email and website. And thanks. Hope you've enjoyed the talk.
Well, thanks, Liz, very much for that fascinating talk. I would say inspiring talk. When you hear about one person's journey through those changes, I mean, it really is eye-opening. So I thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Harry.
Okay, we'll now turn to questions, and we had one question on email that came in prior to the meeting, and this is from Danny Rosenberg. He says, Muslims believe in the Torah as one of their 4 holy books and would therefore be expected to support the prophetic return of the children of Israel to their land. How do you think it's possible to convince Muslims that it's okay for Israel to stay, and perhaps even a good thing for them? In other words, how can we convince hearts and minds that Israel is part of their future too? I mean, there may actually be a couple of questions in that, but
yeah.
but I'll leave you to.
So thanks, Danny, for the question. First of all, I'd just like to say personally, I don't believe in sort of forming political opinions based on religious scripture. It obviously is useful that we can say, well, the Quran says X, Y, and Z, but I don't think that's a useful term, because I think it kind of perpetuates this kind of Islam-only centric view. I would say, human rights discourse is something that we need to work with. But yes, there is a religious justification in the Quran for Zionism. So there is that. I just don't draw on that because I don't make my beliefs that's not how I live my faith. And I think it's dangerous because, not in this case, but generally, if you're basing all your beliefs on a religious text, which in our community is taken literally or very conservatively, it's just a bit kind of narrow. But yeah, there is that in the Quran actually, and also we do believe in the Torah. I think most Muslims, again generalizing, do believe in the Torah as from God, but perhaps not in the exact written form it is today. But a lot of Muslims, not myself, would take the Quran as it is today, kind of verbatim from God, and that does justify Israel as the land of the Jewish people. So yes, it is there, and I think it's a nice kind of way to reflect in sort of scriptural reasoning, but I think on a wider level, I think that's unhealthy, because I think we should kind of get away from kind of religious discourse on that.
Okay, thanks very much, Liz. We've got one question that's come in on chat. Do please add questions on chat if you have them. And this is from David Stone, who says, important talk, thank you. How can we upscale your pioneering work to reach the wider Muslim community? Thanks,
David. Well, first of all, I mean, I'm only one person, but sharing stuff that I post on social media, things I put on the blog, I think if you've got connections with Muslims, just having those conversations, getting involved in interfaith work. I'm part of Muslims Against Antisemitism, so having to promote our work. So I think, firstly, on a personal level, if you've got those connections, obviously not sitting down and saying, hey, let's talk about Israel, but building those friendships and connections, and then they can start seeing the influence of Israel in your life. You can start understanding each other, and then when that trust is built, having conversations. 2, getting involved in other organizations, and 3, promoting voices, such as myself and other organizations.
Okay, thanks very much. We don't yet have any other questions. I mean, I'm interested in one. I'm interested in the various sets of beliefs you went through. I mean, and I think it's fair to say, starting with left-wing political beliefs and then accepting Islam as a religion, regardless of what either of those belief systems think about Israel or the adherents think about Israel, how did you find the transition from one to the other? Or did you find that they fitted each other, that your political views worked very well with your religious views, or were there tensions between those?
No, there were definitely no tensions when it came to Israel-Palestine. and there were tensions with other things. But when I converted, I don't want to generalize, but I think it's a bit of a sort of tendency you become quite conservative. Also, the community in the UK, I think the British Muslim community is very conservative compared to other communities. Plus, I'm married into a conservative North African community. So it was almost like it kind of legitimized it. It was just a de facto position. But you've got a bit more of an emotive, you've got that spiritual link now. So rather than being slightly disconnected as an activist thinking, oh, I want justice for Palestinians as I want all humans, as a Muslim, you do have that connection with, but they're my fellow Muslims abroad. So I think they just kind of backed each other up. I was very conservative. Now I've kind of gone through my own kind of spiritual journey, which is and isn't related to this journey. It's all kind of part of one larger journey about kind of exploring my own beliefs, kind of socially, culturally, politically, religiously. I mean, as we said, if you were very, very religious, you could go and look in the Quran and find, you know, the justification for Israel, but that's not how it works in terms of the Muslim community. And that's also not how I lived my beliefs. Even though I was conservative, I didn't follow the text in that kind of way. As a community, it's generally very anti-Israeli. So I came in being anti-Israeli. The mainstream belief was that, and it fitted. And I suppose that more of an emotive link.
Okay, thanks. Barry says, thank you for sharing your journey with us. And question from Tony. How would you view an undivided Jerusalem in coming days? Says thank you, Barbara, but I'm sure it's from both of you, Tony and
Barbara. Firstly, I do believe in two states, but my kind of belief is I'm not Jewish or Israeli or Palestinian, so it's not up to me to say what works and doesn't work. What I like to do is kind of break down false narratives, hateful narratives, and kind of promote reconciliation. I think a lot more peace could happen, but it's not going to happen. I don't want to point fingers. And I have issues with Jerusalem. For example, I've already boycotted Al-Aqsa because if Jews can't pray on Temple Mount, why should I pray in Al-Aqsa? So I have issues when it comes to Jerusalem. I think Jerusalem should be not ruled by either, purely just out of kind of pragmatic reasons. But I've not really got bogged down in the details. I feel like there's so many voices who aren't directly affected. I'm not, so I want to take a step back from that and just, you know, help amplify the voices that are doing work. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, okay, question from Sarah. Thanks so much for your fascinating talk, Liz. Why do you think the language about Israel is so extreme, e.g. evil, blood, etc.? And were there any such words used about other countries by left-wing activists?
Well, this is really why I do believe that in most cases, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So, you know, if somebody was literally against all nation states, then they're not sort of singling out Israel, so that would be fine. But in the case where, you know, most countries and religious groups kind of have their own country, for example, you know, I believe in Israel and also believe in Kurdistan, for example. And just looking at the kind of language used, it's never about like specific policies. It is about the existence of Israel. And I've come to the conclusion that it is because of anti-Semitism, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly, like an unconscious bias. And as Sarah said, you'll then see that with the language used, which goes back to kind of racist tropes, blood libel, etc. And I think the more that you learn about the history of anti-Semitism and the different forms, then you can see it coming through. As I said, I'm convinced that anti-Zionism predominantly is anti-Semitism. Perhaps they don't always see it, but why the fixation on Israel and it being so evil when there's plenty of other countries? For example, a problem that I see in the Muslim community is people are very quick to call out issues against Muslims when committed by non-Muslims, but not when the aggressor is Muslim. So if somebody was a big anti-Israeli activist, not against the existence of Israel, but was talking about specific policies, but was also talking about Iran and all the policies there, then I might sit down and say, okay, is this person actually anti-Semitic? Obviously, it's up to the Jewish community to define that. But that's not what we see. There's just this like obsessive focus on Israel and the language. Okay, they might say Zionist, but if you unpack it all, and sometimes they do say Jewish, and they'll talk about, oh, religion, they don't understand the ethnicity there, you know, killing children and all this blood libel. I've got to say, I think the reason why it's there must be anti-Semitism, because why this for that country when there's plenty of other things happening, but you won't see such kind of language. Like you'll never see about, you know, China shouldn't exist. There's lots of human rights abuses in China, but no one talks about the destruction of China. So that is my conclusion. It's anti-Semitism. Historic, and it continues.
Thank you. And one from Anthony. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible journey. I also started being very left-wing and very misinformed. And upon becoming Baha'i, I had to confront my views on Israel, as our world center is in Haifa. And I had to square the protection Israel gives us as a religious minority with my pre-existing prejudices. I can only say the feeling of first setting foot in the Holy Land was exhilarating, and one that I will never forget. Well, I'm not sure that's a question, but I think it was a very interesting contribution. I don't know if you want to respond
one of
to
my
that.
ex-partners was Baha'i, and it was very interesting seeing their cultural connection to the Middle East outside of Israel, and then this connection to Israel. So somebody who came from a Muslim country, it was a theocratic country, but not having this hatred for Israel, and it was just very refreshing. And I didn't know about the Baha'i connection to Israel. And it was funny because when I said that my partner was Baha'i, the only people that knew what Baha'i faith was were either people that were very into interfaith or the Jewish community. So there just seemed to be this nice little bond, and I would definitely love to visit the gardens there. It's beautiful. And I thought it was really nice that you've got that bond together. So yeah, I'm not connected to the Baha'i community anymore, but they're definitely very interesting, something I'd like to find more out about. And yeah, I hope to visit the gardens too. I think it's a really, really nice bond and connection there.
Yeah, it is a beautiful place, by the way. I've seen it. I should also mention, if I can butt in, that one year when North London Friends of Israel was at the Palmer's Green Festival, the Baha'i had the stall next to ours.
Oh, that's cute.
And they were very supportive and gave us cups of tea and told us how much they loved Israel. So that was quite nice. Okay, I mean, Sarah has responded, I think, to your response to her question, said, sounds like pure tribalism. Thanks for your reply, Liz. And Brian has asked, a number of us would consider that there is already a two-state solution, that is Israel and Jordan, and that as Transjordan was created in 1922 to satisfy Arab nationalism, then that already is a Palestinian state. What is your view on this? I suspect it's going to be similar to your answer on Jerusalem, but
I'm not going to comment directly on that, because whilst I'm quite an outspoken person, I don't want to get completely trolled. So I'm not going to comment on that. I'm going to say, I look at it from now, whatever has or hasn't happened, this is where we are now. And I still think a kind of two-state model based in sort of Israel and Gaza and the PA, I mean, that's kind of where people are. How can we move forward and create a solution based on now rather than the past? So, I mean, I would sort of say Gaza and PA and some sort of link there, and then the rest of Israel, and then Jerusalem being independent. It would be nice if it could be ruled by both, but that's just not going to happen. And as I said, I've got issues with Al-Aqsa and lack of access for the Jewish community. So I say we go with, well, what's the situation now? What do people want? I think a two-state solution in terms of West Bank and Gaza and the rest of Israel seems kind of pretty standard, and most people kind of on our page seem to be with that. But it's ultimately, it's up to the people who are going to be living there to decide that.
Okay, thanks very much. I think actually this might be a good point to leave the questions, and it remains for me to firstly to thank you very much for a fascinating talk. It's a powerful talk of a journey that you've been on, and I think it's things that will be new to most of the people who are listening. So thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Thank thanks for
Okay.
having me talk, and I'm glad I've been able to share, and any more questions, just get in touch. And it's been good to share my story. Never would have expected to be doing this, so things can always change for the better. And that's a message of hope for us.
Right, well, thanks very much. And what I want to do now is to just finish by saying a bit about North London Friends of Israel. And I'm going to screen share again. Right, well, thank you so much, Liz. And I now want to say a bit about North London Friends of Israel. As I said at the beginning, we're back to our normal activities. We very much hope that as many of you as possible will be able to get involved. So especially if you're not on our mailing list already, if you live in or around the North London area, please get in touch. We've already, since lockdown ended, have done street stalls in Hampstead, Enfield, Golders Green and High Barnet. Our next street stall is on Saturday, the 9th of April in Enfield. We send out an email usually around once a week, giving details of our activities. So please get involved. If you're not already, get on our mailing list and find out how you can help the cause. And the contact details for that are on the screen. So you can email us at nlfriendsofisrael@gmail.com. You can go onto our website, nlfriendsofisrael.wordpress.com. There's a contact us tab. And we're also on social media on Facebook and Twitter. So thanks once again, Liz, and thanks to all of you for your time and contributions. Thanks very much indeed, and good night.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. That was brilliant.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.